And so I guess part of this narrative, right, that the U.S. was set up to be without a central bank. It resisted the implementation of a central bank twice successfully. On the third attempt, we got the Creature from Jekyll Island. So part of this first step toward successfully implementing the U.S. central bank or the Federal Reserve System, as you write in your book, was to scramble the public's understanding of the nature of money itself. And so if you don't mind, I'll read a brief excerpt here. And this is from the subsection in your book titled, "What is Money?" And you wrote that the first step to this maneuver was to scramble the definition of money itself. For example, the July 20th, 1975 issue of the New York Times, in an article entitled "Money Supply, a Growing Muddle," begins with a question: what is money nowadays? The Wall Street Journal of August 29th, 1975 comments, "The men and women involved in this arcane exercise of watching the money supply aren't exactly sure what the money supply consists of." And in its September 24th, 1971 issue, the same paper said a pro-International Monetary Fund seminar of eminent economists couldn't agree on what money is or how banks create it. Even the government cannot define money. Some years ago, Mr. A.F. Davis mailed a $10 Federal Reserve note to the Treasury Department. In his letter of transmittal, he called attention to the inscription on the bill, which said that it was redeemable in lawful money, and then requested that such money be sent to him. In reply, the Treasury merely sent two $5 bills from a different printing series bearing a similar promise to pay Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis responded, "Dear sir, receipt is hereby acknowledged of two $5 United States notes, which we interpret from your letter are to be considered as lawful money. Are we to infer from this that the Federal Reserve notes are not lawful money? I am enclosing one of the $5 notes, which you sent to me. I note that it states on the face, the United States of America will pay to he, the bearer on demand, $5. I am hereby demanding $5. 1 week later, Mr. Davis received the following reply from Acting Treasurer M.E. Slendy. Dear Mr. Davis, receipt is acknowledged of your letter of December 23rd transmitting one $5 bill, United States note with a demand for payment of $5. You are advised that the term lawful money has not been defined in federal legislation. The term lawful currency no longer has such special significance. The $5 United States note which received with your letter of December 23rd is returned herewith. The phrases will pay to the bearer on demand and is redeemable in lawful money were deleted from our currency altogether in 1964. So can we just talk about that little exchange? And then maybe you could go into the differences, as you do in your book, between commodity money, receipt money, fiat money, and fractional money.
Yeah, that's so fundamental. And I'm glad that you picked up on that, Robert, because that's the reason I put that section in the book, because unless people had an understanding of what money is, all the rest is just hopeless. We're talking about something we haven't defined the topic yet. And interestingly enough, even though there's a great void of understanding of what money is, it's not complicated, really. It's pretty simple.
No.
And as I went back over the historic records, all the way back to the beginning of the founding of the United States, it was pretty clear to me that people in those days had no trouble understanding what money was. Everybody understood what it was, and they used it. And it didn't come from the government in many cases. In fact, the word dollar comes from, I think it's the Dutch word thaler, because it was a piece of private money issued by a fellow by the name of Thaler. And he just said, hey, guys, I can make these little round nuggets of gold and stamp them, and I guarantee you they got this very pure gold in them. And sure enough, everybody who tested them said that these thalers are really what they say they are. Sure. And it didn't take a government to endorse them. The word went around, and people all over the world say, hey, do you have any thalers? I'd rather be paid in a thaler, because they had confidence that its purity in gold was reliable. And so thalers were greatly used in the United States. When it came time to put a word to the American currency, they just took the word thaler and said, we're going to use that. We're going to use that temporarily in the beginning. And we identified that as our currency. So thaler became the dollar. And so even the origin of the United States dollar comes from a private mint. So the idea, and people understood this, is that you could use anything as money so long as the person with whom you're dealing agreed with you that it was something of value. Right. So now we get into the question, well, why did certain things end up being accepted by the populations without laws requiring them to do it? Why did they voluntarily all eventually agree that this is what we will use as our preferred money supply? And now we get into some very interesting stuff. What is the nature of money? What should it be? What is the difference between good money and weak money or bad money? And that's where it gets really interesting. And as I said before, not too complicated. I think a grade school or a high school kid for sure could understand the principles. So back to the question, what is money? the dictionaries have little different definitions depending on which dictionary you use, but they all sort of agree on the concept, the central idea, which is that money is a medium of exchange. Now, the active word there is medium. It's not the exchange. It's not the goods or the service that you exchange. If you exchange goods or services directly between one person and another, like I'm going to trade my my Model T Ford for your grand piano or something like that, that's called barter. That's a direct exchange. But if you have an intermediary, it's like, well, I've got the grand piano, and you want my piano, but you don't have anything. I really want a Model T Ford as a collector. And you say, well, I don't have a Model T Ford, and so forth. Well, what have you got that I could maybe give to somebody that does have a Model T Ford? I said, well, I got this block of gold here. In fact, I got $27 here. Is that of interest to you? Oh, yeah, that's of interest because the guy that owns the Model T Ford will probably take the thalers because he knows that he can pass them to almost anybody else. So all of a sudden, the thaler or the gold pieces or buckets of wheat or jars of jelly or something, Disneyland ride coupons or whatever people say, oh, yeah, I can use this for some. I know people who take this. It's a medium of exchange, not the direct exchange. So it's a very simple concept. You don't have to give the other person exactly what they want, but you have something that they will take because they can pass it along to somebody that has exactly what they want. So that's simple. So what is the medium of exchange? Over centuries, millennia actually, all acceptable medium or media of exchange that have come into popular use have had to have one, well, actually several qualities to them, but the one that most people don't like to talk about is that it has to have intrinsic value for something other than money. Otherwise, it's not going to last historically. If it has no value for anything other than money, then what if you got enough money? I don't want that. It's just paper, or who knows? There might be a war come along, or the power might go out, and nobody will be able to use this stuff anyway. So it has to be fungible. It has to, it can't decay, and all these things. It has to be rare. There are a lot of qualities that are assigned to it. Not all money of the ages has had all of those qualities, but the ones that have had all of those qualities are the ones that have survived the longest and been most useful and has not harmed anybody. It's been beneficial. And the items that always wind up as being used and meeting all the requirements of a good money are metals, precious metals. It doesn't make any difference where you look, in what continent, what age, what culture, where there's been a long enough time for people to experiment with different forms of money. Always it evolves. Well, I shouldn't say always. There are a few exceptions in the islands and so forth. Anyway, in all the major continents and all the major civilizations, it always evolved into gold and silver. Not because somebody said, you will take gold and silver. We are hereby writing a law that gold and silver are going to be our money. It's because people chose it by popular demand and experience. So that's really the bottom line lesson of all of this, is that money is a medium of exchange, and that to be good money, it should be something of intrinsic value for something other than money. And the reason for that, as I think it's important to explore, is because something of intrinsic value for something other than money means that it takes human effort to produce, just like what you're exchanging it for. Goods or services take human effort. If you exchange a piece of paper that takes no effort except to run it through a printing press, and you exchange it for a Model T Ford, there was a bad exchange, because here's something that took human effort on one side and took nothing but political resolve on the other side. Somebody's going to get cheated on this deal in the long term. So that in a nutshell, you could actually talk for days about the importance of all those other elements of what is a good money and so forth. But you always come back to the understanding that something of intrinsic value. Now, that's something that people don't like to talk about today, who are really deeply into cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, because they do not, well, they'll argue that it has intrinsic value because people accept it and you can use it for certain accounting transactions that you can't do well with other forms. But I'm not talking about that. That's not the definition of intrinsic value that takes human effort to produce. So it's a question that even brings into question how really valuable the digital currencies are that we're talking about, because it just takes political will. It just takes a group of politicians raising their hands, I vote for this, and then that money comes into creation. And you expect that to compete on an even scale with something that takes human effort to produce. It's a dream. It won't happen. It will persevere over time. So now if you want to go into the history of it, I'll try and make that very, very simple. In the beginning, the natural money was those things of intrinsic value, in the very beginning, I believe, as discovered in the clay tablets they found when they were digging through the ancient civilizations in Nineveh and so forth, they came across this huge storehouse of clay tablets underneath some temple. That here's the history of the prehistory historic world. We're going to find out what already happened. Well, it turned out that most of them were accounting records of jars of wheat. Ahab gets 7 jars of wheat anytime he wants it, and we're storing it and so forth. And that's what most of those records were. There were some very interesting historic records too, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the world's first true story in it. And that's where you find the story of Noah's Ark, actually written thousands of years before the Bible and so forth. It's the origin of the story of Noah's Ark. But the point really is that most of these historic records were jars of wheat. So that was what they were using as money in the very beginning. Yeah. You had wheat, excess wheat, put it in a jar, and boy, anybody would take it in exchange for their services or something else that they had. And then later on, they would exchange cattle and other livestock. In fact, the word pecunia, we use it in our language today. A pecuniary transaction means a monetary transaction. And I'm told that the origin of that word, pecunia, is Latin for cow. So a pecuniary transaction is a transaction using cows as something of intrinsic value. And then finally, the development of metals came along. And that was really of intrinsic value because you needed metals like iron and eventually steel for weapons. Now, there's nothing more vital in a primitive society than a weapon to defend yourself. And if you have a more aggressive mind, a weapon to steal your neighbor's stuff. And a weapon for a sword, and having metal for a sword, and metal for a shield to protect yourself against the other guy's sword. And finally, metal for guns and off and running. So metal made its debut as the first deviation of money away from livestock and living things. And finally, the development of precious metals introduced an element of scarcity, which is a very important ingredient of good money. Whereas it turned out that eventually iron and copper were not so scarce after all, after the refinement techniques were improved. So there's the history of it. You go from one item of intrinsic value to another and end up with precious metals. Now, maybe someday in the future, that evolution will go into something like uranium or something like that because of the energy component. But that hasn't happened. Whatever it is, it will be something that will be scarce, and it'll have great value for something other than money.
No, that's an excellent overview. And the term actually I prefer for intrinsic value is industrial use value, as determined from monetary use. So gold, for instance, say 20% of its market cap is for demand for gold as use in electronics, dentistry, et cetera. Then 80% of its market cap is demand for gold as money. And I think the example of pecuniary that you cited there and the jars of wheat are very telling, because money in this way, it's kind of like a form of stored energy, right? A stored potential energy. Like that's what one of the original monies was food itself, which is just
yes, a store of human energy.
Yeah,
it's already been expended.
Right.
Yeah, it's already in part of what you are looking at. It's already in it.
Yeah. So the proof of work, right? And this is so essential, right? The proof of work that's imbued or represented by that money is so important because back to your other point, if money is that instrument that we use to acquire goods and services, and all goods and services require human energy, doesn't it only make intuitive and obvious sense that the money itself should also require energy to produce? Otherwise, someone could just, if you can produce the money for free and use it to acquire things that are costly, then you have this asymmetric relationship that you can just, quote unquote, print money and steal from the providers of goods and services.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the system we live under today.
Yes.
That's precisely what we're talking about when we speak of the Federal Reserve System and all the other central banks of the world.
Yes. And so back to this notion of maybe a relationship between money and truth, it's that money that has the greatest integrity or the greatest fidelity to, human time and energy, the proof of work in it, which is that the money is what it says it is, right? As you were talking about the private minter of the dollar, right? When he certified this thing had 1 ounce of gold in it, well, he was telling the truth. So that instrument became favored on the free market as money. And I guess the one point of possible disagreement between us would be just on Bitcoin specifically. I know that Bitcoin doesn't serve any industrial use, but it does have proof of work built into it. So you have to expend energy to create Bitcoin. And so I do think that it could serve the role of good money. And my thinking there is looking at the properties of gold itself. You mentioned a few of them, though I usually narrow it down to divisibility, durability, recognizability, portability, and scarcity. I think gold was basically the best tool for the job historically. It's satisfying those 5 properties that people seek in money. And Bitcoin does that job even better. But it does, and this is like Mises' regression theorem, right? Where he says money has to start as some commodity and have an industrial use before it can become money. Bitcoin does violate that in a way. So it's I guess an interesting, outstanding debate. But in my mind, people are ultimately going to seek out those properties, and I don't see any technology that better satisfies those desired properties of money other than Bitcoin.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I don't want to get into a debate as to Bitcoin's merits because I'm a Bitcoin fan myself.
Yeah.
I have some. I don't have a lot, but I look at it mostly as a speculative investment that is probably going to go up in value. I don't know whether it'll be around 1,000 years from now or anything like that. Like gold probably will be. But also, you're right. It takes effort. It takes energy to produce it. But it's lacking another element of good money, and that is its indestructibility. If the power goes out, it's gone. And of course, people will say, well, that's true of American dollars right now. The power goes out, the banks close down. Well, that's true. That's one of the problems with the American system right now. It's one of the weaknesses. So Bitcoin adopts that weakness and says, well, it's got to be okay because, see, the dollar's got the same weakness. Look how well the dollar did.
Right.
And, of course, the dollar is going to collapse, as we know.
Yes. No, I think it's a fair point. There's definitely strengths and weaknesses to each technology, and gold certainly has the longest track record.
There are people out there today, I've gotten quite involved with some of them, who claim that they are onto a technology where you can extract gold from almost anything. They say, and it's pretty convincing how they demonstrate that, is that gold is one of the most prevalent minerals in the earth. It's everywhere, except we don't measure it because it's what they call monatomic. It's the gold that exists in such great quantity is single atoms, and they're not bound together. And I've forgotten the number, but the gold that we are used to holding in our hand and making jewelry out of is not monatomic, it's multiatomic, and they're formed into molecules, or clusters, I guess is the word they use. And now all of a sudden it becomes visible and becomes testable, and you can weigh it and use it. But in the monatomic form, you don't even see it. It doesn't show up. So their technology is, how do you get those atoms of gold to be, so to speak, to join together? And they say they're hot on it. They're on the trail of it. And some of them even say, well, we got the secret, but we're not telling anybody. I don't know. But the reason I mention it is because if the day should come that somebody will figure out how to create gold without mining it, and they can just extract it out of the seawater, for example, like they claim, then all of a sudden gold will no longer be a suitable basis for money because it'll be too easy to get.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. And I guess the subtlety here is, and a good thing, really, we don't have to choose the winner, right? You don't have to put all your eggs in one basket necessarily.
No.
You can hold some gold, hold some Bitcoin, hold dollars if you believe in dollars, I suppose. But they all have, there's trade-offs, right? And this is the nature of economics. Electricity might be a weak point of Bitcoin, but as you just said, gold could also get disrupted by some innovation.
Could be, theoretically.
Theoretically.
So then if that happens, there will be something else.
Yes.
There's got to be something else